Okay, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order, and I say good afternoon to everyone. We were scheduled for this morning. My script said if I stayed with the script, I'd be telling you good morning. But being of unsound mind, I don't read the script. Welcome to today's hearing entitled The Next Great Observatory, Assessing the James Webb Space Telescope. In front of your packets, everybody knows that here, containing the written testimony, the biographies, and the truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. And we'll be making opening statements, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for taking time from their very busy schedules to appear before our committee to discuss the James Webb Space Telescope. And I realize considerable effort goes into the drafting and writing of the statements, but they're very helpful to us, and they're helpful to these folks that aren't here that have conflicts and they're at other hearings right now, or they'd be here, but they get your copy. They have the copy of what you've submitted to us, and we thank you for that. I want you to know that your testimony, your wisdom, and your experience is going to be invaluable to us, because we have you here because we think you probably know a lot more about what we're doing than we do, and we realize you're giving up valuable time to prepare for this, to travel here, and to grace us with your presence. And your experience will be invaluable to help our committee and our Congress as we deliberate in the months ahead and related issues to NASA and its portfolio of programs. The James Webb Space Telescope has been identified by the astrophysics community as its top priority program since 2001. And just recently, NASA itself named Jwst as an agency priority. The telescope would far surpass in size, power, and capability any previous space-based observatory launched by the NASA, and will enable the new observations into the deepest corners of our universe. And I suspect it'll be at least a generation or two before a successor mission is even contemplated. The potential new knowledge that'll be returned is, in my mind, difficult to imagine. While observatories are designed and built to answer one set of questions, the record of is replete with discoveries that even the builders of telescopes never contemplated. But that's not why we're here this morning. Sadly, the James Webb Space Telescope is another case study of NASA's mismanagement of a flagship mission where original cost and schedule estimates are grossly understated. Project execution is a litany of missed signals and deferred work, and senior agency oversight is invoked only after the project files breach reports. The resulting disruptions and breakage do tremendous collateral damage to other agency programs and missions as management to struggles to find the resources to return JWST to a sound footing. Not too many years ago, NASA's stakeholder community would not be overly surprised with cost and schedule slippages. It seems to be an accepted way of life that technically challenging missions were expected to exceed original estimates, but Congress' tolerance for these type of overruns has run out. I support the James Webb Space Telescope. The science enabled by this mission will be extraordinary, but Congress and the White House's struggles to bring our federal budget under control, there are members who have a tough time continuing to vote for a program that requires another infusion of over $1 billion. Some have argued that we should cut our losses and move on. Others have suggested that we're rewarding bad behavior by continuing to invest in the mission. In my view, NASA's latest replan for the James Webb Telescope is the agency's last opportunity to hold this program together. I'm anxious to hear from our witnesses about their assessment of the steps taken by the agency to ensure high confidence in the cost and the schedule estimates going forward and in the project's new management structure. I'm also anxious to hear about the biggest challenges still confronting the program. Mr. Howard, don't take this personally, but I want the record to note that the NASA's testimony was provided to our committee late yesterday afternoon, contrary to committee rules and past practice. By holding back testimony, members and staff were afforded only a handful of hours to review and analyze administration statements, undermining the ability of the body to engage in a well-informed dialogue with executive branch witnesses. The White House's process for vetting testimony of agency witnesses continues to frustrate this committee and frustrates Congress. This is not the first time testimony has arrived only hours before the scheduled start of hearings, and I urge the White House to exercise greater diligence. And I doubt seriously if they'll listen to me. My thanks again to the witnesses. And now I'm honored to recognize Mrs. Johnson for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to say good afternoon to our witnesses, and I join Chairman Hall in welcoming you. I look forward to hearing from each witness today. As Chairman Hall has stated, we are here to review the status of the James Webb Space Telescope, which has been the subject of much attention over the last year and a half as NASA has wrestled with cost growth and schedule delays on the project. NASA has now developed a plan for getting the project back on track, and Congress has provided the agency with the funding that it has requested for the JWSP in fiscal year 2012. I look forward to hearing about the replan from our witnesses, as well as about any challenges and risks that still exist. In that regard, Mr. Chairman, I believe that this committee is going to need a regular updates on this project from NASA so that we can have confidence that its milestones are being met, and so that we can have early warning of any problems that may develop. I want to work with you and the agency to ensure that we get those status reports on a regular basis. It is very important that NASA ensure that this project proceeds without further turmoil. As we will hear today, the telescope's project's cost growth will have a negative impact on all of NASA's science activities, not just those in its astrophysics division. In dealing with the cuts that will be required, I think it is important that NASA allocate the cuts to its science programs in a balanced manner that doesn't unduly target any single area, such as NASA's plenary science program. I look forward to hearing more about NASA's offset proposals in today's hearing. In closing, as we take a look at the status of the James Webb Space Telescope and the issues the project needs to address, I hope that we don't lose sight of why the United States is undertaking this complex mission in the first place. The National Academies has rated it as a top priority for the nation's future astrophysics program, and the scientists here today will be able to tell us about the path-breaking scientific research it is being designed to carry out. But there is something at stake beyond the exciting scientific breakthroughs it promises. Namely, like the Hubble Space Telescope before it, it will have the ability to inspire coming generations to dream and to want to undertake careers in science and technology. It's clear that for many of our young scientists and engineers to be a starry night or a picture of a galaxy obtained from a telescope like Hubble, and perhaps someday from the JWST, is the spark that will start them on their way. In the midst of our scrutiny of the issues surrounding this, I hope that we don't forget that simple truth. I thank you again to our witnesses for agreeing to testify today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I thank you. Gentlelady yields back. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements can be added to the record at this point or whenever you present them. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Rick Howard, Program Manager of the James Webb Space Telescope for NASA, a position he's held since early this year. Previously at NASA, Mr. Howard served as Deputy Chief Technologist, Deputy Director of the Astrophysics Division, and has held a number of positions in the Office of Space Sciences. Mr. Howard is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, received an MS in astronomy from Pennsylvania State University. And Mr. Howard, we welcome you, sir, and thank you. And thanks for the previous visit. Our second witness is Dr. Roger Blandford, the Director of the Kavli Institute for Particular Astrophysics and Cosmology and the Luke Blossom Chair, I'll get all that out in a minute, in the School of Humanities and Science at Stanford University. Dr. Blandford also served as chair of the National Academy of Sciences, Decadal survey of astronomy and astrophysics. Dr. Blandford received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees from Cambridge University. And welcome, Dr. Blandford. We appreciate your presence here today. Our third witness is Dr. Garth Illingworth, an astronomer at the University of California Observatories and Lick Observatory. He is principal investigator of a major Hubble Space Telescope imaging program and has been involved with major space and ground projects since the 1970s. He served as chair of the Astronomy and Astrophysics Advisory Committee and has a long record of involvement in science and astronomy policy. In 2010, Dr. Illingworth served as a scientist member of the Independent Comprehensive Review Panel that reviewed the James Webb Space Telescope program. Dr. Illingworth was awarded an honorary Doctor of Science degree in 2010 by the University of West Australia, and we appreciate your being with us today. Our final witness is Jeffrey D. Grant, Sector Vice President and General Manager of the Space Systems Division, Northrop Grumman Aerospace Systems. Mr. Grant's worked for Northrop Grumman since 2002, and previously he worked for 21 years at the CIA and National Reconnaissance Office. He received a BS degree from the Florida Institute of Technology and has earned a number of performance awards during the federal service. It's good to have you here. I had a nice visit with Mr. Grant earlier and found out that his father and I served in World War II, probably at different bases and in different airplanes. I flew Hellcats for the Navy, and he flew the PBY, and we talked about the PBY, and he asked me if I would like to have flown the PBY. I said that's what every naval pilot wanted to fly, because it took off at 90, it landed at 90, it flew at 90, and pilots live to be 90. So, and I hope your dad's still with us. I didn't get to ask you about that, but God bless him. Okay, as our witnesses should know, a spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, at which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize our first witness, Mr. Rick Howard, to present his testimony. Mr. Howard, you have 5 minutes, but we don't have a hook. We get after anybody. Just do your best to stay as close as you can. But your testimony is so valuable and your presence is so appreciated. We'll have a gentle chair for you up here. Go ahead now.
I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today to testify concerning NASA's progress and plans to complete the James Webb Space Telescope. Let me begin by expressing NASA's thanks to this committee and to Congress for its continued support of this program in the FY12 budget. We at NASA recognize that we made your already difficult task of funding important programs in these distressed physical times even more difficult through our poor past performance on JWST. We are thus even more determined to restore your confidence in NASA by delivering a successful JWST on the new cost and schedule baseline that we have developed. It is important to remember why we have undertaken this effort. JWST will be the world's premier space-based observatory and will be both the scientific and technological successor to the Hubble Space Telescope. JWST will be the most powerful telescope ever deployed in space and will have 100 times the sensitivity of Hubble. No other nation on Earth could lead such a pioneering endeavor. In my written testimony submitted to this committee, I outlined the new baseline developed for JWST and provided detailed responses to the questions posed to NASA by this committee. I would like to provide a brief summary of the main points of those responses. You asked about NASA's justification for continuing JWST. JWST is the primary tool for addressing many of the major questions scientists have about the origins and physics of the cosmos. JWST was a top priority large mission recommendation in the 2001 Decadal Survey and was considered foundational in the 2010 Decadal Survey. The independent analysis of alternatives submitted to the Congress in October showed that the JWST remains the most cost-effective way to answer these science questions. The JWST team, including more than 1,200 people across the United States, is on a new path and has made good progress in FY11 against the milestones that we established back in January of 2011. Concerning the progress or the process we used in developing the new baseline, NASA worked closely with its industrial partners to arrive at a new cost and schedule baseline for JWST by undertaking a thorough, bottoms-up analysis of the work yet to be completed. NASA and our independent standing review board and other independent groups then subjected the resulting baseline to rigorous risk, cost, and schedule analysis. The end result is a robust baseline that NASA is confident we can achieve. Let me address the work to go and the remaining challenges in the program. A significant portion of the work to go is the integration, test, and verification of the observatory. This includes the integration and test of the instruments, the optical performance tests of the full 18-segment telescope at the Johnson Space Center in Texas, and the integration and testing of the spacecraft and sunshield. These efforts represent the major technical challenges remaining in the program. The major programmatic challenge is maintaining a stable budget environment and consistent support of the program within NASA, the administration, and Congress. The new baseline is complete, and it is now our responsibility to deliver JWST within cost and on schedule. Let me close by again thanking the Congress for your support of JWST. Your willingness to fully fund JW in FY12 in support of the new baseline demonstrates your commitment to sustaining this nation's leadership in space science. NASA is committed to completing this program efficiently and successfully. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee today, and I will be pleased to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Now recognize Dr. Roger Blandford to present his testimony. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Space Telescope, and for the opportunity to add my personal perspective. I believe that this support is a courageous recognition by you of the scientific importance and value of the telescope, and an expression of confidence that NASA now has the management of this project under tight and realistic control. Webb is a 6.5-meter infrared space telescope. It provides a huge increase in performance over previous telescopes and promises to be a scientific game changer. The two main reasons the 2001 survey chose Webb as its highest priority recommendation are its capacity to trace light back to the first stars and galaxies when the universe was just 4% of its present age, and its potential to revolutionize our understanding of how stars and planets form in our galaxy today. These reasons remain valid and are now joined by the opportunity to study the many, now more than 700 exoplanets that have been discovered around other stars. However, Webb will also operate as an astronomical observatory, and many, and perhaps most areas of astronomy will be transformed by Webb in much the same way as they have been revolutionized by its predecessor, the Hubble Space Telescope. Unscripted discoveries like the realization that 96% of the universe is in an unseen dark form, that massive black holes reside in the centers of most galaxies, and that most sun-like stars are orbited by planets are likely to be made by Webb. Decadal surveys compel the astronomy community to plan an executable program for the coming decade and beyond. The astronomy community respects the outcome of these deliberations and acknowledges that the most ambitious projects typically take more than a decade to bring to fruition, which can lead to delays in realizing newer entries into the program. The American Astronomical Society, which reflects the views of the general astronomy and astrophysics community, continues to support Webb despite the strain its delay is placing on other proposed missions. For the above reasons, Webb is a cornerstone of the scientific program that was recommended by the 2010 astronomy survey, New Worlds, New Horizons. I believe that if Webb were not to be completed, then a very large part of the combined science program of these two decadal surveys would not be executable, and there would be a consequent call to propose new infrared facilities to replace Webb. I believe that launching and operating Webb would be scientifically transformational and internationally inspirational. It would also make a powerful statement that the United States still has the resolve to execute large, technically challenging and innovative scientific projects. No other country currently has this capability. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you. I hope that my testimony will be helpful, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Now recognize Dr. Garth Illingworth for his 5 minutes of testimony. And thank you for staying within your 5 minutes, Mr. Blandford.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Chairman Hall, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the James Webb Space Telescope. And I would also like to thank you for your support of the recent Public Law 112-55 that included the full amount of funding needed to get JWST back on track for FY12. This was a crucial step and setting it on the path for launch in 2018. James Webb Space Telescope is Hubble's successor. Webb will explore scientific frontiers that will not be accessible to any other telescope in the foreseeable future. It will seek and find answers to some of the great questions we have about the universe, many of which were unforeseen when James Webb was conceived. Yesterday, for example, we saw the announcement of the discovery of a planet, Kepler 22b, in the habitable zone around a nearby star in our galaxy. Only JWST has the capability to see if liquid water exists on nearby planets like this one. The Nobel Prize was awarded recently to 3 astronomers who discovered dark energy. Only JWST can take some of the needed steps to advance this field. Early this year, my team found the most distant galaxy ever, a dwarf galaxy those that led to the building of the Milky Way. It was a faint blob, very young in its formative years. We did this by looking back through 96% of all time to when the Hubble was in its infancy. We cannot go further back with Hubble. Only JWST can explore the first stars and galaxies. Chairman Hall, you asked me about the major faults identified by the Independent Comprehensive Review Panel and how NASA has responded. The major faults with the JWST program were not technical, but were related to management and budget. The NASA replan takes great strides in addressing the major faults identified by the panel. There is now much stronger management and oversight. JWST is now a separate program office at NASA headquarters with experienced staff, led by Rick, reporting to the associate administrators of the agency and of the Science Directorate. Key leadership changes were made in the James Webb project at Goddard. Communications have improved. The JWST program has developed a far more conservative and robust plan than before, and one that is meeting both the detailed recommendations and the spirit of the ICRP's panel report. The excellent progress on some critical technologies, like the mirrors, and on the recent milestones over this last year, also add to confidence in the program. Of course, technical and programmatic challenges remain, as one would expect of such a unique, one-off program with cutting-edge technologies that have never been developed before. This is the first time. These challenges, however, do not appear to me to be extraordinary for such a major project at this point. Big projects will always have such challenges. The most critical factors, in my mind, for assuring that JWST is launched on schedule and on budget are: 1, James Webb needs to be fully funded with adequate reserves in every year. Shortchanging James Webb at this point will only create additional budget and management problems in the future. The James Webb management team must keep all the diverse elements of this program focused on meeting their milestones and schedules during the lengthy period that remains. Both the project and the independent assessment groups must work diligently to identify problems and address them rapidly. And fourthly, it is essential that Congress, including this committee, continue to be engaged and provide the necessary support for NASA to be successful on James Webb. If James Webb is fully funded, it will be on track to launch, NASA will be on track to launch the largest and most powerful space observatory ever built by late 2018 within the $8 billion cost cap. Chairman Hall, I thank you and the committee members again for your recent support that has set us on a path to making JWST a reality. Launching James Webb will demonstrate again our leadership in science and technology to a world that has been fascinated by Hubble's remarkable results. As others have said, only the US, has the capability to do such a mission. Thank you very much, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions.
Mr. Illingworth, thank you very much, sir. Mr. Grant, present your testimony. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Hall, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today on behalf of the men and women of Northrop Grumman who are supporting the James Webb Space Telescope. I, too, commend the committee for your continued support and oversight of the space program, and especially with regards to your interest in the James Webb Space Telescope. I would also be remiss if I did not recognize NASA's leadership in making the Webb Telescope program possible, and also acknowledge the extraordinary contributions of our innovative science community. It is through our combined efforts and expertise that we come together to build the world's next great observatory. It was in 2002 when Northrop Grumman, then TRW, was awarded a key contract on the James Webb program, a larger-than-ever space telescope required to operate at ultra-cold temperatures, designed to explore the first stars and galaxies of the universe and study extrasolar planets. Without question, these are significant capabilities, and it was a significant challenge. The Webb telescope represents a capability beyond anything attempted by NASA, our nation, or anywhere in the international community. As for our role at Northrop Grumman in the Webb telescope program, the estimated contract value over the lifetime of the program is estimated at $3.5 billion, with nearly half of those funds already applied to advancing key technologies, completing designs, and fabrication of critical hardware. We currently employ approximately 265 engineers, scientists, technicians, support staff at our Space Park facility, and partner with 193 suppliers in 31 states across the country. In your invitation letter, Mr. Chairman, you asked that I respond to 3 specific questions. 1, what are the technical and programmatic challenges facing the Webb Telescope program? 2, Northrop Grumman's steps to ensure cost and schedule deadlines are met. And 3, the role of integration and testing as we move the program towards completion. As others have testified here earlier, I reemphasize the point. Our chief technical challenges on the Webb Telescope, I believe, are in 2 major areas. 1 is the completion of the build and testing of the telescope itself, and 2, in building and testing the thermal management system. Though much has been accomplished, challenges remain, and we recognize we need to do better moving forward. In the second area you asked about, we've responded to the Cassani panel findings and have made significant management leadership changes, management oversight changes, and through improved communications and decision-making processes, have strengthened our relationship between our team, NASA, and our partners. We continuously evaluate actions to contain cost and have implemented a series of improved financial controls in the form of metrics, reports, and early alerts. These measures have been designed to ensure contractual discipline to avoid unintended cost growth. The Webb Telescope has a clear path forward, and we have evidence that the current plan is proceeding on track. Lastly, the Webb Telescope program has a detailed integration, test, and verification plan, which is designed to reduce program risk through methodical, incremental build and test, retiring risk at each successive integration level of the observatory. These integration and test practices have served our other satellite systems very well, as we typically see our satellite systems last for many years longer than specified. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I understand the concerns the committee has raised, and feel confident that Northrop Grumman has taken the necessary actions to address the technical and programmatic challenges before us. We're also taking the proper steps to ensure cost and schedule guidelines are met, and we are enabling our team to successfully reach program completion by meeting integration and test milestones for the Webb telescope. I'm honored to join my distinguished colleagues on this panel today, and thank you for asking me to appear before your committee. I welcome the committee's questions and ask that my full statement, as provided to the committee, be inserted into the record.
And thank you for that, and thank you for staying within your time. We're in a different day and time, and as all of you know very well, for projecting the needs and selling this Congress and selling the American people on the amount of money that we're going to put into these programs. And we've just gone through trying to increase the debt allowance there, and we voted that, and that spawned that famous committee of 12, supposedly 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. Well, that wasn't really true. There were 6 Republicans, all right, and we could name them. There were 6 Democrats plus an additional Democrat who happens to be President of the United States. And these other 6 Democrats didn't have the power to override a veto of that 7th Democrat. It was a 7-6 thrust to start with. So that we didn't have a chance to get that off the ground. But those are things we're going to be facing in the future, and this is a wonderful program, and all of you have done a good job. Dr. Blandford, especially, you laid out several real reasons why the good things are happening and how you want them to continue to happen. But recent JWST progress reports indicate that I think 75% of the hardware is already completed. Yet a little less than half the estimated $8 billion development costs have been spent. If so much hardware is completed, why will it cost an additional $4.5 billion to complete it? Who should I ask that? Mr. Howard?
Probably me is the right person to ask.
Okay, all right.
So, of the $4.5 billion to go to launch in the development phase, the biggest element of the work to go is the development of the spacecraft, sun shield, and the integration and testing of all of those elements of the observatory. That's the instruments and telescope together, and then the spacecraft and the sun shield. Jeff Grant mentioned a little bit about the complexity of that effort. The integration and test activity is the most complicated endeavor that we have ahead of us. This observatory cannot be tested all fully assembled in the environment that it's going to see in space at 40 degrees above absolute zero. The best we can do is to do subscale tests, subsystem level tests, and tests at the largest level of integration we can, which will be down in the chamber in JSC, where the telescope and the instruments will be able to be tested, but not the spacecraft and the sun shield. That'll have to be done separately. So that is a significant portion of the work to go on this program. The next largest element of the work to go is the development of the ground system for JWST, which is an activity that is going on at the Space Telescope Science Institute to develop and operate JWST and operate the instruments to be able to provide the observations that the science community will propose to examine.
Mr. Illingworth, you were a member of the Independent Comprehensive Review Panel, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And what opportunities have you had to thoroughly review the replan? And are you satisfied that NASA's put forward a responsible and executable plan moving forward?
Mr. Chairman, the committee, of course, was an ad hoc committee that met for 2 months and developed this report, which NASA has been responding to for the last year. So the committee formally has not gathered back to look at the developments. However, I have tried over the last year to gain as much insight as I can because of, as a scientist interested in this program, I really want this to succeed. I want NASA to succeed. And so I have been talking to people across the agency, trying to understand how things are developing, looking at the material that became available publicly. And as I said in my testimony, I laid out in somewhat more detail, I feel that NASA has actually done a very good job on this replan. They've developed a plan that is conservative, I would say uniquely conservative for NASA in the level of reserves and the approach that they are taking. They realized that they had seriously flawed management before the time of the ICRP and are trying to rectify it, as Rick said. So I'm highly encouraged by what I have seen over the last 6 to 9 months on this program.
You know, how much time do I have? Okay, I got about a minute and a half left. You remember the Augustine Committee and their recommendation that we need an additional $3 billion a year for 2, maybe 3 years to save our space station. Our space station's in danger right now, and our whole program's in danger. Our country is in a dangerous situation. Money's going to be hard to come by from this point forward. If they just, I think the last 3 presidents have failed, and this committee and members of this committee on both sides have urged them to put more money into the space program where we could have a chance to save it. That didn't happen. So we've got a bleak future right now for a wonderful project, and I'll talk with you more about that later. I think my time's up, and I thank you. This time I recognize Mrs. Johnson for her 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Hubble Space Telescope has revolutionized humankind's vision and comprehension of the universe, and JWST promises to do the same. And while I'd like to spend time learning more about the inspiring science that JWST is being built to study, instead we find ourselves focusing on budget and program challenges. So I'd like to get clear on how we got to this point with JWST, and as members of Congress, we need to understand how this situation can be avoided in the future. And so is this a case of cost being poorly estimated to begin with, leading to insufficient budget and reserves, or is this a case of the program being mismanaged, or is it some combination of the two? I'd like Mr. Howard to start, and followed by Dr. Illingworth.
Okay, thank you for the question. The cost commitment by NASA at the time when JWST was confirmed, when we passed the confirmation review in 2008, was $5 billion. The cost is now 8.8. I could give you lots of reasons in history on how we got to where we are, but this does not excuse the poor management, cost, and schedule performance of JWST over that period of time. I hope that the details on the history and the changes that we have made that are in my written testimony demonstrate that we have changed the management priority, the management and the priority and the approach, and have developed a robust baseline and are ready to demonstrate that we can deliver JWST within cost.
Thank you. Let me add to that. I would say the Independent Review Committee came up with a number of reasons, but let me just very succinctly put the reason, the most clearest and simplest reason that I can think of. At confirmation in 2008, this project went from a phase where it was developing novel, new, extraordinarily hard technologies into a phase where it was building hardware, testing that to launch. The project management and the program management overall did not recognize this change of approach, that now they were in a construction phase, they needed to meet deliverables, they needed to stay tightly on schedule, and they could not defer work. And so the project, I think, was on a path that was never going to meet. We said this clearly in the report. It was never going to meet its launch date, given that it was deferring work and driving up the costs as a result. So it was only when that was identified, NASA took that to heart and came back with a replan that they got to the point where I think they can be on track now to launch this within the cost cap by the 2018 date, because they have adequate reserves in there to meet the problems on a yearly basis, of course, provided the budget is provided each year after this one that's appropriate as needed for a 2018 launch.
Thank you. Mr. Howard, what signals did NASA miss about the potential cost growth and other programmatic problems that it should have picked up, and what is NASA doing about it now and attempting to manage it?
So I think one of the signals, as Garth mentioned, was the fact that we knew that we had insufficient reserves in the early years in this program, even when it was confirmed, and the attitude was do the best you can with the budget that you have. Now, part of that was because this program was managed within the Astrophysics Division, within the Science Directorate at the agency. That is one of the biggest changes that we have made. This is no longer one mission out of 30 or so that the Astrophysics Division has to try and balance across its portfolio. In the 2008-2009 timeframe, just for example, in that 1 year, Astrophysics had 5 launches that it had to support, including the Hubble Servicing Mission, the Kepler mission, which we just had a discovery yesterday on, and the Hubble Servicing Mission and Herschel and Planck. And in those, typically in astrophysics, I've been there for 10 years or so, you put your resources on the missions that you have operating, your assets that are in space that are doing the great science. And then the next thing you do is you put your assets on those missions that are about to launch and need to be supported to be successful. And within that constraint that you have, it was very difficult to add additional resources as JWST found and identified problems. One of the biggest changes, in my view, is elevating this program to an agency priority, an agency program where the funding, the additional funding required to complete JWST comes out of both the Science Directorate as well as other parts of the agency. And that increase in terms of elevating its priority has been significant in terms of being able to address the issues and resolve the budget problems, especially in the near years. This budget profile, as far as I'm concerned, is the best profile as far as reserves in every year that this program has ever had.
Thank you very much. Time's expired.
And effectiveness of their government. The sentiment is that our process and procedures themselves help cause these problems. Professor Illingworth said in his testimony, the pace of the federal budget process necessarily leads to large lag times for fixes to be implemented. What lessons can we learn regarding our system of budgeting, procurements, or project management based on the James Webb Space Telescope experience? And we can start, Mr. Howard.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think this is a learning process that we've gone on over a number of years at NASA. When JWST was confirmed to start development in 2008, we did not have the tools in place at the time to look at and do an assessment of the cost to go and the schedule to go. We did not have this current policy in place, which requires doing a joint cost and schedule confidence assessment, which is a much more detailed assessment of both the cost and schedule and how they are integrated together and the risks associated with that, than just doing what was traditionally done before that, which was just an independent cost estimate. So the agency has made decisions to proceed on directions that looks at more detailed cost estimating. With James Webb, we had not done that. We have done that now. So this program and rebaseline was subject to that level of analysis. One thing that has come out from the ICRP report, which I think the agency has to look at, is for these large, complex missions that are very complicated and being done for the very first time with new technologies and completely in areas that we don't have experience in before. should we be looking at these with a higher level of confidence that we want to assign to them, higher than the 70% that is typically used in the agency? I think that's something for the agency to think about and consider as we proceed forward.
Thank you, yes. And as Mr. Howard said, I think a very important factor here is from the earliest days in programs like this, ensuring that you're working to a high level of confidence. In fact, the agency has adopted 70%, but the ICRP explicitly said for programs of this nature with their complexity, an even more conservative approach at the 80% level, joint cost schedule, was more appropriate. I think if that is done from an early phase and it's recognized by the key players, Congress, the administration, NASA as the group doing the program, then the budget lag issue becomes a lesser issue. But in the JWST case, there was a catch-up that NASA recognized there was a problem but couldn't catch up. And until it got to the point where it became a public issue. And then at that point, ICRP got into this and recommendations were made. I think this was very beneficial. I think it brought it home to a lot of people across the whole of the programs like this that changes were needed and a more conservative approach was needed. And I'm glad to see from what I've watched this year, seen this year, that NASA has taken that to heart and really is planning this program with a much higher level of reserves to a much greater degree of confidence.
Thank you. NASA is planning a number of high-priority missions recommended for the next decade by various decadal surveys. How will James Webb cost overruns affect high-priority missions outlined in the astrophysics decadal surveys such as WFIRST? And to the extent you have insight into the other science mission divisions such as Earth Science, Heliophysics, or Planetary, can you also comment about James Webb's impact to the greater science portfolio? We start with Mr. Blandford.
Sorry. I think it is clear that it will lead to a deferral of the start of these proposed missions like WFIRST, and I think that will also, it will have some impact, although we don't yet know what the NASA plan is, and this will probably be manifest in the next budget, on emissions from other parts of space science. It is obviously a great disappointment to the scientific community, but I think it's one that they will have to accept. And we will, I hope, build WFIRST before too long, and it will have its glorious scientific program ahead of it.
Dr. Illingworth, do you have anything to add?
I think, yes, thank you. I think Dr. Blandford has said it very well. It's a key concern for the community. I think that none of us involved in the James Webb Space Telescope like to see changes like this happen that push out other programs. It's very regrettable. But the James Webb Space Telescope was the highest priority program, and so ultimately it becomes a question of priorities. When resources are tight, that's where we go. We choose the highest priorities. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mrs. Lofgren, gentlelady from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want first to particularly welcome the two witnesses from Santa Clara County, Dr. Blandford up at Stanford and Dr. Illingworth from the University of California, Santa Cruz, located at the Lick Observatory, also the tip top of Santa Clara County, and it's great to have you here. I think this hearing has been very helpful because obviously we have a number of questions to ask. First, are we on track? What lessons have we learned for the future? And then also, I think there's a fundamental question, not for me, but for the country at large, and including some of our colleagues, of why we're doing this. You know, when you see the discovery yesterday by the Kepler telescope, it renews my enthusiasm. It wasn't lagging to begin with, but you know, in these times, you know, why is this important to America? What does this matter in terms of make out the case for science, but also for society, on why we should make this investment? Dr. Blandford and Dr. Illingworth, if you would.
take that. Perhaps I could supplement and said there was actually a second discovery yesterday that was reported, which was by my colleague Professor Chung Pei Ma from the University of California at Berkeley and her team, reporting on the most massive black holes found in
that's
the
right.
nuclei of galaxies. Now 10 and 20 billion solar masses, beating the previous record of 6. So the pace of discovery does not let up in astronomy, and it won't with these wonderful new telescopes. What it does for society, I think there are many answers to that, but undoubtedly it inspires young people. It is many scientists and technologists. It is an entry point into what they ultimately build careers on. I think the developing high technology is a generator of jobs. I'm not an economist myself, but I think that there is a large multiplier that can come from such projects.
Well, there certainly has been with all the NASA programs.
Involving NASA programs. And it is inspirational for all of us. I think astronomy is remarkable for how communicable the results of contemporary research are. How communicable it's become, and I think we can all enjoy at very different levels the results that come from these wonderful telescopes.
Ben, could you have anything to add, Dr. Illingworth?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. Interesting, I think today there's going to be an announcement that Hubble scientists have published the 10,000th paper with that telescope. This is absolutely remarkable productivity for an amazing mission. I think the science is, in a sense, unquestioning. We all know of Hubble and the amazing things that it has done, and James Webb is its successor. But I think more immediately, as you mentioned, for the societal interest in this, beyond the inspirational aspect that comes from a science program like this, there clearly are jobs. There are high technology jobs that are very important that can only be done here. We do them close links with our contractors. And as Dr. Blandford mentioned, and my wife has pointed this out to me too, she's an economist, that there's a multiplier effect, which is many times when you do a unique high-tech or skilled job like this. And so there are job benefits in the short term. And over all time, now out to long term, are the educational benefits, the STEM issues, doing science and technology education. This is just so critical for us. And missions like this bring into everybody's living rooms, as we've just seen in the last day with announcements of new discoveries, amazing scientific results that only we really can do with these missions.
Thank you very much. I am already convinced, but turning to you, Mr. Howard, in your written testimony, you mentioned that these missions are technology providers enabling and reducing technology risk of smaller missions that could otherwise never afford to develop such technologies. What sort of other benefits may we see from this mission? What were you thinking of?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. In addition to developing technologies that other missions, smaller missions, just would not be able to do in the time frame or without the resources that were already invested in missions like JWST. The technologies developed on these large missions benefits other agencies. And so a couple of examples is right now we're actually flying on Hubble a technology developed by JWST. An integrated circuit system which was put on for the advanced camera for surveys when we repaired that on the last servicing mission is a technology that came out of JWST.
Wow.
In addition to that, the innovations in metrology technology that have been made on JW have trickled over into the medical device metrology, measurement of human eyes, diagnosis of ocular diseases, and improved surgery. And there's a technology that you wouldn't necessarily have thought applied over, but it's these new innovative metrology techniques that we use to develop the large mirrors that has trickled over into other areas.
Mr. Howard, I see my chairman's about to gavel me out of order. I would welcome the additional list I think you were about to tell us. If you could send that to us after the hearing, I would love to see it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And I thank you. Before I recognize Mr. Brooks, I want to recognize Mr. Illingworth mentioned something about his wife. We have a wife here. of Congressman Holmgren of Illinois. We're very happy always to have you here. I recognize Mr. Brooks for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although I believe that's Mr. Bouchon's wife. Both. Oh, they're both here. Well, I've been looking to the left, not to... Sorry about that. Now to more serious matters. Well, we had the White House Christmas party last night. That explains a lot. The Science, Space, and Technology Committee has put together a timeline concerning the James Webb Space Telescope. And in June of 1997, the original estimate was a launch date of 2007 at a cost of roughly $500 million. In 2001, the telescope identified by NASA as a top priority in the decadal survey with an estimated cost of $1 billion. In the summer of 2002, we had a mission definition review that indicated the cost was now $2.5 billion with a launch date of 2010. In March 2005, NASA identified further cost growth, now $4.5 billion with a schedule slip of 2 years to a launch date of 2012. We move on to July 2008. We have another program confirmation review that says that the cost is up to $5 billion and a hoped-for launch date of 2014. Then we move to September 2011, and we now have a baseline of $8.8 billion total life cycle cost with a launch readiness date in 2018. So we've had a slippage both in cost and in launch dates. I want to put that in the context of some of the financial issues that America is facing. As many of y'all know, in this last 3 years, we've had budget deficits of $1.4 trillion, $1.3 trillion, and $1.3 trillion. Our accumulated debt is now over $15 trillion and is growing at over $1 trillion a year rate with no end in sight. Our interest on our debt was a little over $200 billion in the fiscal year that ended September 30th. However, those were at record low interest rates, somewhere in the neighborhood of below a percentage point for short-term Treasury bonds, short-term being a year or two or less. Long-term, it was a little over 2%. Compare that to Italy, which is a little bit further along the path that America faces with these deficit problems, where their bond rates are now over 7%. If something like that were to happen to America, and if we continue on this path, and it will happen to America, you can see our interest on the debt jump from the $200-something billion range to $600 billion a year or more. That all having been said, I think y'all can get a pretty good grasp that we have some serious financial issues facing us. Now, what's the reaction that we're looking at right now in the United States Congress? Well, we're looking at spending more money, $180 billion of additional debt on our country for this year alone for things like extending the Social Security and Medicare tax break that last year was given to American citizens out of cost, by the way, to the solvency of Social Security and Medicare, extending unemployment compensation benefits, the sustainable growth rate, fixing that, or the doc fix as it's commonly known, to help ensure that Medicare patients have access to physicians when they need it. The list goes on and on and on. That having been said, I'd like y'all's rather quick insight on whether the James Webb Space Telescope is truly the #1 priority for NASA, in which case if we have to reduce funding for NASA because of all these other issues hammering us all at the same time, we'll know that you're comfortable with reducing those other items because they're lesser NASA priorities, or if not, what NASA priorities are higher priorities. And Mr. Howard, if you could please go first.
Thank you. Sure, I'd be glad to. The NASA administrator has stated that his top 3 priorities in the agency are JWST, SLS, and MPCV. And certainly as the budget deliberations go on and we see what the actual budget comes in at, that has to be relooked at to see how we can continue to proceed with those 3 priorities. I can't predict exactly what will happen for 13, but I know for in 12 those 3 programs are funded at the appropriate level to continue forward.
It's very hard for me to speak on behalf of the administrator and NASA. I don't think I can. My opinion is that science is, the space science program is one of the things that's most important for NASA to do. It does it extraordinarily well, and I hope that in the coming budgets, its past successes will be reflected in the future program that is recommended.
Mr. Chairman, I see that my time has expired. I don't know if you have enough time for the last two
We have a new
witnesses.
chairman now. I'm going to make sure that you have the time to make sure that your question is answered by all of the witnesses. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Illingworth.
Thank you. I recognize what you're saying, and I think that a key path forward out of our problems lies with education, with technical and scientific education and a skilled workforce. I think that programs like James Webb and many of the other ones in NASA, but particularly the high priority programs, are absolutely essential to this. And James Webb is 3% of the NASA budget, and less than 1/10% of our discretionary budget. It's very small, I think, for the huge gains that it brings for inspiring our younger people to look to the future and improve our scientific and technical education. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr.
Thank you. I would like to add to the comments made by my colleagues. I personally find the program inspirational, and we have early in the program built a full-scale model of this James Webb Space Telescope. We've taken it to Seattle, Colorado.
If I could take the chairman's prerogative, we'll give him time to get his question answered, not something else. Go right ahead and answer his question.
I believe that inspirational programs should be part of NASA's priorities.
Well, my question was, what are lesser priorities that you believe should be cut, or do you have the James Webb Space Telescope as the top priority, which by inference means everything else is what we should be looking at if we continue with these cost overruns with the James Webb Space Telescope?
Sorry, I can't answer that question for NASA, for the administrator, but what I can say is the program I find inspirational and believe that programs that are inspirational.
Let's go down the witnesses. Could you answer that question? James Webb is the number one priority, the rest to be cut?
This, as Rick said, the administrator has clearly stated the top three priorities are. I think as Dr. Blandford said, science plays a truly major role, and we do it through NASA in a uniquely inspirational and powerful way worldwide. Nobody else can do this. So personally, I would have to, give high.
So you're not going to answer the question. Would you like to answer the question?
I think the reason why Dr. Illingworth and myself had hard to answer this question because I'm not terribly familiar, and I don't think he is, with the other two major components of the administrator's list of priorities.
Mr. Howard?
So one thing I wanted to point out was that the NASA administrator has decided that funding the additional funds for JWST in this time period, it still stays within his top line budget, what he gets. And I think it's important to recognize that it was seen as this needs to be an agency solution and not just out of science, not just out of astrophysics. And this is why
I don't think that was the question. Could you repeat your question to the witness?
Thank you. I am trying to get from y'all individual opinions, not your assessment of what NASA's priorities may be, although with respect to Mr. Howard, they may coincide with NASA. But your opinions as to what the priorities should be at NASA and where do you place the James Webb Space Telescope? So that if the James Webb Space Telescope continues with these cost overruns, what, in your judgment, are lesser priority items that we should reduce funding for in order to fully fund the James Webb Space Telescope?
And so just let me finish what I was saying, which is I think some of those decisions have already been made, and you will see them in the operating plan that comes forward next month in terms of where the reductions are made in space science across the other divisions in order to pay for the increase in FY12 to cover James Webb. And that will be in the operating plan.
I'll let the record show that this is a very significant question and that at least three of the witnesses were unable to answer the question. Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. I'm going to try at the end of my 5 minutes to ask you a question you can't answer so I can get 10 minutes of your time. I appreciate your testimony, and I know you see strong support for this project by and large here, but obviously concern about the cost overruns. And I thank you for addressing those head on and indicating that any management lapses that were part of the reason for the overrun are being handled. I'm interested in the telescope for a variety of reasons. One, I'm excited by just the pure discovery element of it, which I think can energize a whole new generation of scientists and other careers in the STEM arena. And so certainly as an education driver, it's a significant and I think meaningful investment for the country to make. But I'm also interested in it as an economic driver. Given the cost associated with it, even with the overruns, I think that the multiplier effect it has in terms of economic opportunities and frankly jobs that can be created are significant. I thought I heard in some testimony that there were over 150 up to 200 different companies or suppliers that were part of delivering components for this telescope. And I assume, and I'd like whoever would want to address this to do so, I assume that has kind of a pulling effect in terms of those companies that are contributing to the effort are developing technologies for purposes of delivering the product to the telescope, but in generating those technologies, they're creating other opportunities for themselves and for their peers within a particular industry. And that's all about being an economic driver. So I think one lens through which we can look at the James Webb Telescope is through this lens of it being an economic driver, and particularly an economic driver for the U.S. economy. So if you'd like to speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, I'll answer that. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we have over 1,200 full-time equivalent positions across the country that are supporting James Webb right now. That doesn't include an additional 200 or 300 of folks that are working at the subcontractor level in the supply chain, providing nuts and bolts and fittings and various things like that. So that is a very large workforce. This is of that total, there's only 100 civil servants. So all of this effort is being done in the U.S. With the U.S. Industrial base and workforce, both the high-tech jobs as well as what you'd think are relatively straightforward jobs like welding structure together that we need to support and build the telescope and hold it on. This is spread across 27 states and the District of Columbia. So the effort is across the entire country and does have that kind of a multiplication factor in terms of the work that's done and that the things they learn from that, especially in the technology area, where they can then take the companies can take those technology advances and apply them to other programs within the United States.
Mr. Grant, maybe you could speak from the perspective of a contractor in terms, obviously you have a certain expertise already in place, and that's how you get the bids to deliver a product. But in providing the product, I'm sure that you're pulling on your own organization to be on the cutting edge, and then you work with other subcontractors and so forth. So you can talk about that ripple effect. I'd appreciate it.
Congressman Sarbanes, one of the examples I would cite as where we've seen the technology that's been invested in JWST come to broader use is just in the area of the optics. We've just completed delivery of the last of the flight segments this year. And the segments themselves are about, from a density perspective, 20 times lighter than the comparable optics that you would see on the Hubble Space Telescope. And what that means to the nation and future systems is that they will be able to harvest that technology and put it into other programs that need comparable large optics or smaller optics at much lighter weights. And that's something that it's taken us a number of years, but like I said, we've successfully delivered all of the mirror segments and really demonstrated the applicability of this technology.
Thank you all very much. I yield back.
Sure you don't have a follow-up question to that? Got lots of time for you. All right, Mr. Holdren, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for being here. And this is really important, and we need to be looking at everything we're doing to make sure that we're doing it as well as we can, and especially looking at cost overruns and things to have that accountability, especially in times like this where times are tight and as we are forced to prioritize. I do believe so strongly. We've had amazing hearings over the last months here in the Science Committee, and really getting back to American exceptionalism historically in science. And just wanted to talk a little bit about that and wondered if I could get your perspective of the role that JWST plays really in America being at the forefront of kind of next discoveries. Hubble, I know, had so many incredible discoveries, and would like to kind of get your thought from two perspectives. One, what maybe we could expect from JWST as far as some discoveries might go, but then also that our role in this as America, how that plays in the international community of drawing the best and brightest from around the world to be a part of this type of thing. So wondered if you could maybe talk about that, if any of you have any thoughts.
There is no doubt, as Hubble's successor, Hubble has been worldwide, has brought attention to U.S. scientific leadership and productivity. As we travel, and I'm sure all of you have had this experience, that coming from this country, you go abroad, you talk to them about what I do, and they are just delighted with Hubble. This is so important for us, that we have these programs that we can all look up to as demonstrations of our leadership and capabilities in science. James Webb will be that program. Hubble will not live forever. Probably sometime this decade, we'll probably see the end of the life of Hubble. At that point, we really would like to have James Webb up there to carry the flag forward for science and for U.S. leadership in this area. Thank you.
Just to add to that, James Webb, I believe, will be the magnet that Hubble has been, and will bring people here from all around the world, and will be the expression of the ability of the United States to execute a program of this magnitude. And perhaps if I might use an example, which many of my colleagues work in particle physics, the Large Hadron Collider in CERN has been a magnet for particle physicists all around the world, and that would be a sort of counterexample, if you like.
Yeah, I feel that one personally. I represent Fermilab, and the Tevatron just shut down in the last month, and have seen so much go over there. And again, that it's going to happen. My hope is, again, that we are active in drawing the best and the brightest here to America, just as Fermilab had done for 30-plus years. So continue. I don't know if Mr. Howard, if you...
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points. I actually think that JW is actually worth more to us now than it was in the past in terms of what it will be able to deliver. Probably even more now so than in the past. Scientifically, it's going to be able to do things that we never thought we could do, make new discoveries of things in the universe. But there are things that have popped up just in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of science questions that we can't wait for James Webb to get into orbit to be able to detect. Water on other planets or orbiting other stars. Right now we have about 50 candidate planets around orbiting other stars that look like they could support water, the right Goldilocks balance between not too hot and not too cold to be able to support liquid water. It'll take JWST 24 hours of observing time to be able to look at one target and say whether or not there's water in the atmosphere of that planet. By the time we launch, there'll even be more than 50. I mean, there'll be a tremendous number more, maybe 2 or 3 times more candidates that will allow us to be able to look for that question. That's just one of the sort of important questions that I think James Webb will be able to do as we move forward.
I have just a few more seconds, but wondered if briefly, another thing we focused on here is STEM education. That's been touched on briefly, but it's so important, again, for our young people to have something to be inspired by. Wonder if you could just talk briefly of how you see this playing into STEM education.
I would say quickly that with the advent of social media and the dissemination of images and results so quickly, people get involved now in a way that they never did before. So this is becoming crucial to have these results out there with the visual images, the power that they have. Thank you.
Perhaps I could just second that by saying that one of the things that I think NASA deserves great credit for is its attention that it's paid over the last 10, 15, 20 years in disseminating, particularly to schools, the results of space explorations. As I said before, these are highly communicable, and they do excite young people and get them started on scientific paths which can lead to all manner of different careers.
Thank you very much. Now we have Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony, especially Dr. Blandford. I know I've been out to Stanford and I've met with Peter Michelson and others at the KIPAC, the Kavli Institute, and I understand the importance of the work that you're doing. It is clear that we're in tough budget times. We have to make sure the taxpayer money is being spent wisely, not being wasted. We need to make difficult choices. I want to start out. We've had questions about the budget and specifically about what's been learned about the processes. But I want to focus first, as Dr. Blandford. Just want to make sure this is clear for the record. I know that the 2001 National Academy's decadal study had the James Webb Telescope as the highest priority. Then in the next one in 2010 assumed that the Webb would be launched. In 2014 listed W first as the top priority. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm clear. Do you believe that Webb is the top priority right now?
What you said is correct. We took it as a given that Webb would be launched when we created our program, so we did not in any sense cross-prioritize as a committee, and so I cannot speak for the rest of the committee. My own personal opinion is the right thing to do is to stay the course on Webb and keep and launch it. Yes.
Yeah, I understand those things happen because the expectation was that Webb would have been
correct.
Already was far enough underway. It didn't have to be put there as a top priority. One other thing I wanted to address when we're talking about what our witnesses can provide for us. I think going back to the question that Chairman Brooks had asked, unfortunately he's not still here. I serve as ranking member on the subcommittee, Research and Science Education Subcommittee with Chairman Brooks, and I think it's an important question of what difficult choices do we make. However, I believe that right now the witnesses that we have here today are not the ones to answer a question about what NASA should cut. Mr. Howard being with in his position, yes, that could be a question you can answer. The other three witnesses, I don't think really are in the position to answer that question. And hopefully, if that question does, if the majority wants to have that question answered, that we'll have another hearing with the appropriate witnesses for that question. But I don't think that the other three witnesses here are appropriate for that question. I think a lot of the other questions that I was going to ask have already been asked. But I just wanted to give, first of all, Mr. Howard the opportunity. You ran out of time. Ms. Lofgren was asking you about what were some of the things that we had gained already from Hubble, and maybe talking about what we could do with the Webb telescope. Was there anything that you wanted to add there that you didn't have the chance?
I think that was in reference to what we've gained as far as the technology developments for
Yes.
JWST. One thing that I would like to add is the talking about the mirror development. This was a very long process of over 10, 15, almost 15 years to develop these mirrors. And initially when this started as a joint technology activity between NASA, the Air Force, and the NRO. to develop large, lightweight, segmented mirrors for use in space. And JWST gained a tremendous amount of insight as to the development of those types of mirrors for our application, which is a cryogenic. The DoD has learned a lot from that activity also and continued on with that activity. So I think that's another good example of the benefits of technology development for these large missions such as JWST, which is not just back into other applications in the United States, for example, in the medical field, but in terms of other agencies using and benefiting from those activities.
Thank you. And I just want to use the last time to also say that I think the benefits for STEM education, as one of the co-chairs of the STEM Ed Caucus, I think it's very important that we continue to do this work with the Webb telescope and other work that we are doing to inspire, as Dr. Blandford and Dr. Illingworth had talked about, inspiring our students today. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much. I hate to be the skunk at the lawn party, but somebody's got to be the skunk before we have to go over and vote.
I think the chairman already decided to do that already.
Well, okay. Well, Mr. Howard, did you ever see the movie called The Money Pit?
Yes, absolutely.
And do you remember that the owner of the house started out and there kept on being problems and there was more and more money thrown into it, and somehow it never really did get done properly? At least that's how I recall that movie. My recollection correct?
Yes, I think the standard line in that movie was, "It's only 2 more weeks."
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I've heard this before with the International Space Station, is that we threw a lot of money into the International Space Station, and it was only getting the Russians to do something, and then there was something else, and then there was something else, and what started out being an $18 billion project ended up being a $100 billion project, and its completion date was significantly delayed. Now, while I recognize, Mr. Howard, that you've only come on board the Titanic in 2010 after it hit the iceberg, here we're talking about a project that has a $7 billion cost overrun from the initial proposal that we had in 2001 and an 11-year delay to completion since the Webb Space Telescope was originally slated to be launched in 2007. Now, how can we justify this to our constituents?
So thank you for that question. I knew it would come sooner or later. So I think part of this is we have to realize that early estimates on the cost of James Webb, going all the way back to the early period of time back in the 97 or before period, were just that, estimates. And the first time that the agency was ready to commit to a price for James Webb was in 2008, and that's the $5 billion. There's lots of history that I could go over as to what happened and led from all those early estimates.
So what you're telling the committee is from now on in we shouldn't believe any early estimates before we start appropriating money, and we should get an actual proposal and see what's going to happen based on that?
I think the early estimates, going back to, if you want to go back to where it was around $1 billion, was for a very simple telescope, 4-meter telescope with one instrument on it, not a suite of 4 instruments. It was not. They did not have the benefit of having detailed cost assessments, nor the industry proposals.
Well, the fear that I have is that you're in charge of a program that's going to end up gobbling up resources that are available to other NASA programs, just like the space station did. Now, I've only got about 1 minute and 40 seconds left, and I want to put something else on the table. When the Hubble was launched, we found out when it got up there that one of the lenses was improperly or incorrectly grounded. And we had to send the space station up on, or the space shuttle up on a real quickie repair mission. have the shuttle anymore. And what's going to happen if we need to repair the James Webb Space Telescope, or we find out that some of the parts in the telescope were not properly done, and as a result, we're not getting the results out of it that we had anticipated, just like what happened before the repair on the Hubble?
So JWST is designed in such a way that it has adjustments to each of the mirrors so that we can adjust the positions of the mirrors rather than what you could not do.
The Hubble problem was not a problem of the mirrors being improperly adjusted. It was a problem of the mirrors being improperly ground.
And we have tested that and checked the mirrors. We've just done that down at Marshall at operating temperature, each element individually. We are also going to be testing all the elements together.
Okay, you still haven't answered the question on how we're to maintain it or repair it, or if something comes up that was not delivered according to specifications, what do we do if it's in orbit and we don't have a shuttle?
So the answer is that we know that we only have one chance to get this right. It's going out to L2. It's not going to be in orbit around the Earth. It's going to a distance 4 times further away than the Moon. And so we are taking every step we can to mitigate the risks to make sure that we do have a system that can work.
You've just increased my skepticism, given the history, and I've been on this committee longer than anybody else. I hope that we'll have some much better answers. Otherwise I can see another money pit coming up, because the space station sure was that. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Edwards. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. And I apologize that I wasn't here earlier. I did have a chance to review testimony, and just want to reiterate how proud and excited we are that the James Webb Space Telescope is managed and directed out of the Goddard Space Flight Center in Prince George's County in Greenbelt, Maryland. The project, as you've described, there are 500 jobs that are supported by James Webb in Maryland, 1,200 jobs all across the country. And I'm sure you pointed out in your testimony in response to questions that other than about 100 of those, they're private sector jobs. And so I think it underscores the importance of the work that we're doing, the phenomenal work that's being done in astrophysics that's actually about job creation, it's about innovation, it's about the 21st century. And so I appreciate that. My question, and I just wanted to note for the record, one of my favorite pages in the Washington Post is in the Metro section. It's the federal workers. And today in the on the federal worker, there's a Roger Hunter is being highlighted for the work that he's done on the Kepler Space Telescope project. And we know now about the just found planet Kepler 22b and the excitement that's being generated because we've discovered something that we didn't know before with a project that started out where we didn't know what we would necessarily find. And I think that that's the hallmark both of what NASA does and certainly what's taking place with the James Webb Space Telescope. I want to ask you, Mr. Howard, just a couple of questions, and one has to do with, as the lessons we've learned over this last couple of years with James Webb. You've highlighted the problems already and the difficulties of going from an idea and some initial estimates to a full-blown project and really understanding what the real costs are going to be and then sharing those with us and developing the kind of management strategies that are going to be important going forward so that we don't run into problems. I wonder if you could tell us about some very specific milestones that we as a committee can look at over this next year where we can hold the agency accountable, the project management accountable, and know that the James Webb Space Telescope is on track.
Thank you for the question. As I said in my written testimony, in FY11 we had 21 milestones that we were tracking and watching to see that we could meet. We met 19 of those ahead of schedule or on schedule. One of those was a month late due to snow, wind, and not fitting into a C-5 transport airplane the way it was supposed to be designed. And one we deferred for good reason because we're in the process of looking at a design change to that unit. For FY12, we've already established about 37 milestones that we have, and of those, the ones I think certainly that rise to the highest level of scrutiny and we want to watch are the delivery of all 4 instruments. All 4 science instruments, including the ones from Europe and Canada, will be arriving this year. That will be major milestones to get those in, as we can then start the integration and testing of those instruments with the integrated science instrument module where they fit. Completion of the mirror testing is just about done. That will be ending up within the next few months. That also is a major milestone to get those mirrors all tested. Completion of the center section of the primary backup structure, which supports the mirrors, is another major activity that has been going on for well over almost a year, I guess, and will be complete of the flight structure this year, the central core. And then I would think completion of the 5th sunshade engineering unit that we're doing, full-scale size of the sunshade. Layer 5 is probably the most complicated, or one of the most complicated ones that we have. And completing the engineering unit of that full scale and the testing to show that it will perform properly in space, I think, is another milestone.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. And you can count on me, and I'm sure others of our colleagues, taking notes about those particular of the milestones that you've outlined for this next year and asking you about them, keeping track of them. And I know that you'll do the same, because I think that will help give us all the kind of confidence that we need going forward, both in terms of completion, but also in terms of the fiscal accountability I think that all of us expect on the project. I won't have time for the question, but really want to underscore the value and the importance, I think, of the private sector workforce here, particularly the work of Northrop Grumman and all of the other attendant folks all across this country who are working on this important project. I look forward to its completion. I look forward to launch, and I look forward to us paying attention to the elements of the project that are going to enable it to go forward. And I know the difficulty of starting out in one place where you're imagining something and then trying to respond to a Congress to get us to make that investment. But because it's science, you don't know what all the variables are until you get into it. And that, I think, for those who are skeptical, accounts for some of the differences, apart from, some other issues that you've outlined, that make it really difficult at the very outset of a project like this and its magnitude to fully appreciate what the real cost is going to be in delivering it. And I think that as taxpayers, we're going to see the value for that dollar, even if we can't see it right now. Thank you very much, and I yield.
Thank you very much. And the chairman will yield such time as he will consume to himself. Let me just note for the record that I believe that glossing over incompetence and mismanagement on a scale such as we are talking about today is not a favor to the taxpayer and is not a favor to the American space program. And using an occasion like this, in which we're talking about $7 billion that is now going to have to be taken out of other space programs, and using this as an opportunity to puff NASA's basic mission is not doing a favor to America's space program nor to the taxpayers. We need to get down to business, and that's why I was hoping that there would be an answer to the very significant question that was posed to the panel. And let me note, no one in the panel answered. The only answer that ended up was that we're going to have the answers in a few weeks when we release some kind of a document. Let me just right to the matter. We just heard people talking about how great STEM education is rather than this cost overrun and what NASA's doing for that. Now, is it possible that we're going to have to defund all of that great STEM program and all of this education because of the $7 billion overrun that we're talking about today? Is that possible? If it's the number one priority, isn't that what we're talking about? So here we are puffing a very nice, good program for NASA, but at the same time ignoring the fact that this cost overrun may cost us that program. Mr. Howard, could you name us some of the programs that are going to be totally defunded because of this cost overrun?
The the $156 million in FY12, which is the increase of JW over the President's budget request, is being split 50-50 between science and the cross-agency support activity. The cross-agency support level that we, with that reduction, takes us down to a level for institutional support to the NASA centers that's at about the level that FY10 was.
But what we're talking about is not just that amount of money. What we're talking about is an overall budget in the future that will then you have to calculate in which programs will be able to be funded.
So
now, like for example, you have the LISA program, the TPF, the SIM. We got International X-ray Observatory, ChipSat. All of these are on the line, are they not?
Some of those missions were not even prioritized in the current decadal, if I remember correctly.
Right.
SIM has been was stopped numbers of years ago before we ran into this situation. But I think it's important to recognize that in the 12 to 16 time framing, we're talking about $1 billion, still not an insignificant amount of money that needs to be provided above what was in the President's budget request in that period of time.
Well, we're talking, if you try to limit the time period that you're talking about, but if you take a look at the magnitude of the money and how that will affect things, for example, I understand the WFIRST, this Wide Field Infra Survey Telescope, that's being postponed now, for 5 years? And look, when you have budgets, and there is a impact when people go over budget. And you could spend half of the time of this hearing, if we want, trying to how wonderful NASA's basic mission is and how it's going to inspire people. But if we keep having cost overruns, you're going to become the laughing stock of the federal budget process, because we will know that we can't count on what you're telling us. Look, I supported the Hubble telescope, even after the catastrophic mistakes that were made in that project, and which caused enormous new costs to the project that had to be taken out of other projects. And let me note, during that time period, I asked who was responsible and who was reprimanded and who was fired. Now, we have testimony today that this is not, this overrun is not being caused by technical difficulties, meaning there's not been some technical thing that just was a roadblock we just can't overcome, but instead by, am I correct, Mr. Illingworth, you suggested that it was budget and management problems. So maybe say that management has something to do with competence, something to do, if someone mismanaged a project of this magnitude, their competence would be called into question. If this was the private sector, it certainly would, and hopefully and this government agency as well. Who has been reprimanded or fired from NASA for this? Is there an answer?
Yeah, there's a very good answer to that.
Okay.
All of the top management on JWST, both at Goddard and at headquarters, was replaced.
Okay.
And there's a new team that's in place, myself being one of them.
Are they still working for NASA?
Those people were assigned to other activities. Some, yes, all of them, I think,
all of them are still working for NASA.
They were all civil service.
Did they take a pay cut?
I do not know that.
Okay. So, no, we know no one lost their job. They just got transferred to someplace else and are making the same amount of money. When we talk about responsibility, and we talk about trying to do our best job for the taxpayer, but also for America's space program, we're not just talking about balancing the budget here. We're talking about having a viable space program for the United States of America. I don't think that we can just have three priorities for America's space program. I think there are a lot of things to do. And I've tried to be very, as I say, there's no one been more supportive of space telescopes and astronomy than I have been in my 20 years here. $6 billion more? I mean, where the money's going to be, we're going to take that money from everybody else's pocket. All this other puffery that we've heard today will be defunded because of because of the incompetence of people that we cannot even take off the payroll. We need to work together. I mean, NASA and Congress. And by the way, I'm open, and Ms. Edwards, I think, was suggesting that maybe Congress, there are some things that we were doing that have contributed to some of these cost overruns, providing not as much money as we had promised or something like that. Maybe, Mr. Illingworth, is there something that we have done that's caused this specific overrun that the Congress has done? Have we? And okay, the vote has been called, so you're all safe.
Mr. Chairman.
But let me just note, Ms. Johnson has asked for a closing statement, and I think that's absolutely fine, considering how much time I permitted someone else to take earlier. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I am just as concerned about overruns as everyone else. But I wanted to share that some years ago, when I was having to wear glasses for nearsightedness, I was always going to sleep, stepping on them, sleeping on them, and go to another room and had left them in another room. And I finally tried contacts because of allergies. I didn't do as well with them. And I went to an ophthalmologist who suggested that I get some corneal implants. That research came directly from the telescopic research. I had to save up my money. The insurance didn't cover it. I paid it from my pocket, $5,000 per eye, and now I can see without any glasses whatsoever. So that's one thing that this research has brought. And I had to wait in line to get this surgery. It is much in demand. And so I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, that when we start, we know that when research has begun, we have no idea what we're going to find. Now, I'm much more concerned about a first strike in a war that we started, and we knew we were getting into war. And now that overrun has been almost $100 billion. And so that concerns me a lot more than making mistakes in research. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point. And I certainly wouldn't ever ignore that point. And it's a very important point for us to understand. And my closing statement basically is this. I have a 7-year-old son. And I have two 7-year-old daughters, triplets. All right. Well, this weekend, guess what? A glass just fell off the table. It came in, and the broken glass is there. And did you drop that glass? Did you push that glass off the table? Oh, the glass just fell off the table. No, the glass didn't fall off the table. He hit it with his elbow. He actually did something to make the glass fall off the table. He will learn his lesson. We've got to learn our lesson. We are responsible when there are failures like this. We are responsible for the broken glass. We are responsible when we don't have the money to do other space projects because we have gone along with incompetence and permitted overruns that are unconscionable and defund other programs. And when we can't even fire the people and get them off the payroll who are responsible for this type of travesty, we got real problems. We in Congress have to solve when we have shortcomings as well. We want to thank all of the witnesses, and thank you for putting up with me here at the end. And we have the questions. With the questions complete, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for any one of you, and we will ask that you will respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. This hearing is adjourned.